G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 4 of the Wabi podcast. Today we're talking about the Gongfucha chanoyu gap, or the difference in approach between Gongfucha or Chinese tea practitioners and Japanese tea practitioners or chanoyu practitioners. There can be a big cultural gap in the way that the respective practitioners of both Chinese and Japanese tea, a loose category, I'll talk about these later, participate in each other's tea gatherings. And I think by talking about this and trying to bridge the way that we bring our own perspectives from our own practice into the other's tea gathering, we can try and enrich the way that we participate in each other's tea to create a more vibrant tea culture. Because of course, outside of Japan and China, these practices are mashed together, and tea people, we can harmonise with each other and have a lively culture regardless of Chinese and Japanese tea practice by participating in each other's events. So polish the floor, grab a tea and tune in. Rotary ho! So first thing is just to note that, of course, when we come, I'm a chanoyu practitioner, this is obvious. So when I go to a Gongfucha tea gathering, I'm bringing a lot of things from my own practice into the way that I view what's going on in front of me. And my interpretation of the unfolding of that particular event is deeply influenced by my chanoyu practice, and of course vice versa. I don't think we can really try and understand another person's culture without our own perspective that we bring into it. It's like, I don't know how we can suspend our judgments and biases to have a totally objective view of what's going on. Like, of course, we can strive to do that, but we're still going to be influenced by our own practice. So I'd just like to talk about those things, those biases that both sides hold. Of course, I'm more able to talk about the biases of a chanoyu practitioner, but still, some of the things that I experience when I'm doing tea for Gongfucha tea people, things that could work a little bit better if there was a deeper understanding about what chanoyu practice is about. To elucidate how our perspectives influence the way that we approach new things, or the way different arts are conducted before us. When I first come back from Japan and started to live in Australia again, one of the first things I wanted to make a point and do was do chanoyu for my family. And I grew up in very country Victoria, down the south of Australia, and the education that my family has, my extended family has in the arts, is a little bit different than some other parts of the world. So, for instance, one of the ways that they understood my tea practice was to jokingly offer milk and 2 sugars in the bowl when I was preparing a bowl of matcha for them in kimono with the full utensils and stuff to try and show them an authentic view of what this is that I'm practicing. So of course we're going to bring our own perspectives in to our participation in different arts and try and understand them from there, and that's fine. I didn't find that insulting at all. I find it actually quite funny, and through that we find a way to find common ground by these cracks and jokes and humour to bridge the gap between each other's practice. Of course, it wouldn't be appropriate to do that in a paid-for event at some establishment where other people that you don't know are participating in good company. Of course, that's okay, but there are similar ways that we can find humour and cracks in our perspective to break open a common understanding. So I need to lay down some definitions, because I'm going to use the loose terms Gongfucha and chanoyu, and not everybody listening to this may be comfortable with these broad categories. But anyway, for the sake of having to use 4 different words on each side to describe the general practice that I'm referring to, just let me unpack. So first of all, with the Gongfucha term that I'm using, the many elements that I'm referring to with this catch-all phrase, there's about 3 broad categories which I can talk about. I don't consider myself anyway an authority to talk about these respective categories within the Gongfucha or Chinese tea culture. Already I'm having Every time I say the word Gongfucha and Chinese tea, without having unpacked what it is I'm referring to, I'm feeling a little bit anxious. So here we go. Gongfucha is a practice that developed with small teapots and a large amount of tea within these teapots, and multiple short-timed infusion to try and extract the different characteristics of the tea and how the tea changes over multiple infusions. The different sweetness and astringency, the complexity in flavour, and the strength and the softness that changes in waves and patterns over multiple infusions in one sitting. And it's not just limited to one type of tea. In a Gongfucha tea session, you might have multiple teas that you enjoy in the one sitting, and it can last for hours. So this term has kind of become a general catch-all phrase for the Chinese leaf tea culture. And at this point, I guess, when I say China, already there's a difficulty because the cultural borders of where tea culture developed was not within the confines of China historically. The borders are relatively new, and even today there are rich tea cultures which exist in the countries in Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Vietnam and Laos. So it's a bit uncomfortable to use Chinese tea to refer to the thing I'm talking about. The second category is cha yi, which is translated, I'm told, as tea art. So this refers to making it a more aesthetic presentation of your tea practice, which can involve a decided or set ceremony or ceremonial way of preparing the tea in an elaborate fashion which sort of mirrors the way that chanoyu is conducted in Japan. Of course, in Japan, there's a set procedure for preparing the tea, whereas in Gongfucha, there's not necessarily a set procedure. Different practitioners will have a different way of preparing the tea, and it might change from time to time depending on their mood or feeling. Cha yi, this will include often like flowers for tea, whereas Gongfucha tea gatherings don't necessarily need to have flowers. You can have a scroll, a calligraphy scroll or something hanging on the wall or alcove to enhance the mood of your tea gathering. You can also bring different art pieces into the way that you prepare your tea under cha yi. So there's sort of a semblance to the Japanese tea culture here in this expression of leaf tea practice. And the third category is Chadao, which is the same as Sado or Chadol, the same characters, the ideographs that are used to write this form of tea practice. And like the way of tea in Japan, that's what Chadao means in Chinese. Cha being tea, Dao being the Dao or the way. So to encapsulate what the way of tea means in a leaf tea context would be something like letting the leaf and the steeping of the leaf, preparing the tea, and its social consequences play an active role in your life in a practical, philosophical, and experiential level. So this, of course, has a great overlap with chanoyu practice. One of the terms we use for chanoyu, of course, is also Chadao or Sado, Chadol, depending on your pronunciation. And this is making your practice of tea affect all aspects of your life. And living tea, living life, that's a good slip of tongue, living life in alignment with the philosophy that your tea practice embodies. So Chadao as a path, a way of living, necessarily incorporates a way to harmonize your relationship with other people and nature, and let your tea practice steep, if you will, your life in philosophy and intention, authenticity, and art. Don't scream at me. As I said, I'm not an authority to talk about the subtleties of the differences in Chinese tea practice. I'm just trying to offer offer a sense of the differences in expression of leaf tea practice in order to now go ahead and use that catch-all term Gongfucha. So I'm obliged also to do the same for chanoyu practice because we have different terms that refer to the practice of Japanese tea ceremony. One of the most commonly known is Chadol, which is just Chadol, which is the Japanese pronunciation of Dao or Wei. And I don't use this term myself because it basically comes from the Kyoto area and more the three Senke schools, the Ura Senke, Moto Senke, and Mushinakoji Senke schools, I would say predominantly use this term. And for warrior class schools, of which I'm a practitioner of one of the traditions of warrior class school, the preference is to pronounce Chadol, Sado. We can pronounce the T character cha and sa, and I would say just about all, if not all, the warrior class T schools will use Sado as the preferred pronunciation rather than Chadol. The difference in emphasis on Chadol and Sado as a practice is not really anything different, but in my mind, they're kind of bound up with the formalized T schools. And so you might think of a sort of rigid, almost militaristic approach to tea practice that puts forward a constant refinement in practice and skill and dexterity in the way that you do your own personal conduct in the tea room, with the philosophical and spiritual aspects of tea sitting in the background somewhat. For me, and I'm emphasizing for me, Chadol and Sado emphasizes greatly the formalized practice of tea schools. So therefore, I use chanoyu as my preferred term because for me, chanoyu has a more artistic, spiritual ring to it in the context of Japanese tea practice and a more individualized approach at tea practice rather than following this or that tradition. And the fourth term, which I can talk about, is one that's pretty much not used at all anymore, but was the original term which Rikyu and Oribe and all those other guys used when they were talking about what it was that they were doing, was suki, S-U-K-I, suki. So this is a term which is rich in philosophical, artistic, and almost religious connotation, as in Zen and Taoist connotation. So this practice of tea is really about trying to align yourself with the different elements that are at play in nature and trying to get very close to these elements as a way to refining your spontaneity and artistic expression and humour and sharing this almost, in Australia we'd say like a larrikinism or playful aspect to your grasp of reality with other people in the tea room. So it can have a very deep philosophical sense at the same time that it can be quite playful. But for ski, the emphasis is finding the cracks in reality in which to really go down and open up the depth of our human experience. So it's a bit of a loose definition. I probably need to do a whole other podcast on what ski means and the meaning of it. Because it's an obscure term, it doesn't have much traction neither in Japan nor in the tea literature translated into English and other languages. It sort of sits there as like a historical concept, but it would be kind of nice if we could use that word because it's very rich in what it means and how it relates to tea practice and integrates tea practice with philosophy and artistic expression. Anyway, so my catch-all for the Japanese side of things is going to be chanoyu today. Okay, so now having outlined what I mean by these general terms Gongfucha and chanoyu, what's the bloody problem then? What's the gap between Gongfucha and chanoyu that is creating a disturbance in the force in our particular ways of tea? Well, the whole experience of a tea gathering, whether it's Gongfucha tea gathering or chanoyu tea gathering, could be a lot more rich and full for all people involved, the practitioner and participants, if there was a deeper understanding of each other's cultures. And this is a sort of prelude to where I think tea should be going in the future, i.e. as different artistic disciplines are starting to mash together and unify in different interesting ways in our current time. Tea practice is ideal to integrating disparate artistic forms into a unified presentation. So the way that we experience art in the future, rather than look at things in a museum or go to a gallery where it sits on the wall and it can be purchased and then put in your home to match your sofa, we need to integrate art more seamlessly into our everyday life and not think of it as something as separate from our everyday life. John Dewey actually talks a lot about this in his thinking around art. He was an American philosopher. So step one is at least tea people to get our act together and start to have a richer understanding of our respective pursuits and a way that we can participate and be a good cultural citizen in the home of the other. And then slowly but surely, different artistic pursuits will start to be good cultural citizens within the tea context. And as I said in podcast 1 with Virgil Abloh's ideas, tea is perfectly suited to becoming a form that can unify disparate artistic expressions and create and forge a way forward to the way that we experience art. So the main difference between the two respective forms of tea would be that Chinese tea or Gongfucha is very pragmatic and focuses almost solely on on deriving the best tea from the tea leaves and the flavours and the fragrances associated with that tea, on drawing those out and sharing them with other people and oneself towards basically an Epicurean experience. But for chanoyu, and it's kind of a criticism as well as a misunderstanding, people often think that the tea is quite secondary. So there's a lot of elements that are related to a Japanese tea gathering or chanoyu that are there that don't necessarily relate to the actual preparation of the tea. So this would be like creating a garden for people to wait in between different parts of a tea gathering, or building a tea house itself. Like, why do you need a tea house? You can just do it in your lounge room when people come over. Or there's the hangings in the alcove, and even the idea of an alcove as an essential part of a tea house. Why does that need to be there? What has that got to do with preparing a bowl of tea? While the elements of a chanoyu gathering create a wonderful experience around drinking the tea, they're not directly related to scooping the matcha, putting it in the bowl, adding some hot water, whisking it up, serving it to the guests, and voila. Whereas Gongfucha is all about getting the best water, getting delicious tea leaves, brewing the best tea that you can from these elements, and serving the most fragrant, delicious tea to guests over multiple infusions and multiple different teas in the one gathering that doesn't have a defined start or finish. Another way we could think about it is that the idea of drinking tea is before the purpose in Gongfucha, whereas in Japanese tea, the purpose seems to be before the idea of drinking the tea. So there's a whole theme and curatorial even that is composed around the idea of a tea gathering, and the tea fits nicely in there, but the developed concept around that drinking of the tea is a lot more developed and is primary almost to drinking the tea in chanoyu. But I said that thinking of the tea as secondary in chanoyu is a misunderstanding. And why that is I think that tea has for hundreds of years in chanoyu been absolutely central. We've found the winning formula. There's no best way, like there's no magical variation of temperature or steeping that we need to do to bring out the best in the tea. We've already worked it out. Like, the data is in. This is what you do. So unlike leaf tea, there's no hit and miss involved. We know how to hit the mark every time in an absolutely repeatable way. Like the tea ceremony and the procedures that we practice and embody when we're preparing the tea are exactly designed to create the most beautiful, delicious preparation of tea every time. Whereas for the leaves, which are often single origin leaves, and you don't know what the variation is going to be season to season with Chinese teas or leaf teas, there is a certain exploration or discovery necessitated each time that you do a steeping or brewing or a session. So whereas in a Gongfucha tea gathering, people might talk about where the tea come from and the terroir and the cultivar, in chanoyu, we don't give a flying cultivar where that tea come from because we already know where the best tea come from and what the best cultivars are. So for example, the cultivars like Saemidori and Gokko are going to produce the best koicha. And the tea regions in Japan that produce the best koicha, grade tea, are around the Kyoto area, and also in Kyushu produce some fantastic matchas for koicha. And while single origin as an idea might be interesting every now and again, for matcha drinkers in the Japanese tea ceremony chanoyu, blends are far and away the best teas. We want that repeatable, surefire experience every time that knits our artistic expression together. It's the centerpiece of a tea gathering is the tea. It has to be bang on. And so therefore, blends are preferred. And the blends, unlike single origin tea or the way that we cultivate wine in the West, and we appreciate that seasonal variation, in chanoyu, we like repeatable taste. So every year, the flavour of this particular tea, so say the poetic name of the tea is like Pine of the Summit, Tokihana Mukashi, each year we're going for the same flavour. So the chashi, the tea producer, will blend the leaf that's available that year to produce the same flavour as last year. And of course, it's quite an unbelievable skill. Like, how do they do this? But they do. And some other notes about the magical formula is that the tea must be hand-picked, it must be first harvest tea, it must be milled with a stone mill, and the water should be just below boiling when we're preparing our matcha, whether it be koicha or uscha thin tea. The only thing I can say with regards to regulating the temperature of the water, like what happens in a Gongfucha session, in China historically, before there was electronic refrigeration technology, this still exists, actually, it's still part of the conduct that we do in our tea preparation ceremony that exists today. In the brazier season, it's towards the end of the tea year, so towards the end of our supply of that year, before the new tea is harvested and put into a tea jar and stored over the summer to open in November. And so during the brazier season, it was thought that the yang energy of the tea is starting to transmute towards yin energy, and therefore hitting the tea with very high temperature water is not a good way to harmonise the gradual movement towards yin energy. So the tea is prepared by adding a scoop of fresh water to the kama before scooping the hot water, so that lowers the temperature a little bit, to add to the matcha and prepare. So that's about the only thing that resembles regulation of temperature with regards to the type of tea that you're using. So this is something that Gongfucha practitioners could make a footnote of when they're participating in a chanoyu gathering. The formula is already there. The tea cultivars that are preferred for koicha are Saemidori and Gokko, and the picking areas are going to be around the Kyoto area and Kyushu, and it needs to be hand-picked, first harvest tea, ground with a stone matcha mill, and the overwhelming preference is for blended tea. And for timing of the picking, traditionally in Japan, it's the 88th day after the first day of spring, which falls around the 2nd of May each year. So there's a 21-day picking season falling around this time, and all the tea is picked that goes into the tea that we use in the Japanese tea ceremony at this time, so in spring each year. Then, of course, the preparation aspects will depend on the school of tea. So depending on whether you're practicing Urasenke or Amotesenke or Ueda Sokoryu or Enshuryu, there'll be different mannerisms and preferences in terms of how to prepare the koicha, the thick tea, and also the uscha, thin tea. For example, a huge discrepancy which you can see within the three Senke schools themselves are between Urasenke and Amotesenke. So Urasenke prefers a quite foamy, like matcha cappuccino with lots of mousse on the top, while Amotesenke prefers to leave some of the liquid clear on the surface of the matcha and have the bowl of tea not completely covered with mousse or foam. It's like think of like a pond that's having vegetation growing on the top slowly. And there'll be some parts of the pond that are covered by the vegetation and other parts where you can just see the water. So quite a radical discrepancy in the preference of both of those two schools. So it's because we've hit upon the magical formula for making bloody awesome tea every time that we don't sit around talking about the finer points of the fragrance and the flavour of the tea. Rather, the emphasis in a chanoyu gathering is how the tea affects our consciousness and knits together the artistic experience of the gathering as a totality. So rather, the conversation in a tea gathering, in chanoyu, is about the themes that are at play. So as a host, I don't particularly want to be asked about, oh, what's the tea you're using today? That's a part of the gathering. We announce that as part of the temai itself. There's a formal part in the temai that we say the producer's name and also the poetic name of the tea. It's integrated into the actual practice. So the questions that are more apt in a chanoyu gathering is about, what does the calligraphy say? What's the concept that is appearing in this scroll today, or the poem that you've selected? And how does that relate to today's theme? And the flower, where does that come from? How does that relate to the overall theme? Or the choice of the art objects, so the tea bowl, the tea caddy, the fresh water container. All these are selected with mind to integrate them into the theme of the day. So the conversation is more about teasing out the concepts that are at play for the host when they were designing the day's gathering. We have to break the ice somehow though, so actually what I've found, to contradict a little bit what I've been saying, is that for people that are not necessarily experienced with the conduct and flow of a chanoyu gathering, to ask about the tea is actually quite a good icebreaker, because you get the conversation going a little bit, and then the host can gauge, oh, okay, guests today are not familiar with the normal conduct of a chanoyu tea gathering, and then you can proactively start to talk about and unpack the theme a little bit yourself. In our repeatable recipe for killer matcha is a vision of the history and evolution of tea culture in Japan. So it was brought over with Zen Buddhism with the monk Myoan Eisai in 1191. And it was a Zen monastic practice. It was part of that. So it was a meditation aid. So the chemical effect of tea on human consciousness, i.e. increased concentration, mental clarity, cognitive function, enhanced memory, suppression of distraction and enhanced relaxation, these elements, of course, we can see immediately are a great aid to Zen meditation. And this peaceful, relaxed state of clarity is what we're going for in the tea room to appreciate the art that's at play. So after the Zen monastic side of tea, tea spread into the upper echelons of society, and these people were not necessarily devoted practitioners of Zen. They used tea in tocha, or tea battles, tea gatherings that were an excuse to display art. And so we have that meditative aspect and the artistic aspect in the evolution of tea history in Japan, which then united into chanoyu. So it's like the thesis, i.e. meditation aid, became the antithesis, i.e. artistic debauchery, and then integrated into a synthesis, which is the chanoyu that we practice today. And in China, for Gongfucha, this elite cultural practice of tea, which was encapsulated in matcha practice, was actually outlawed in the Ming dynasty. So one of the emperors said that there will be no more matcha preparation. Everything is going to be leaf tea. And therefore, matcha practice and the culture surrounding it dropped off, and the emphasis became onto leaf tea practice. So this is another vital element to understanding the different themes at play in the respective gatherings, because the historical evolution has been quite different in respective countries. So now I'd like to talk about the indirect elements that are at play in a chanoyu gathering, which are incredibly important for a chanoyu practitioner, which I feel, after many experiences of practicing tea all around the world with other tea practitioners, not necessarily chanoyu practitioners, are underappreciated or even sometimes ignored when they participate in my tea gatherings. In a nutshell, it's all the details. When you create a tea space as a chanoyu practitioner, everything is included and everything is important, because everything goes into creating the ambience. And chanoyu is very much an art about creating ambience. And so, as an example, the other weekend I was in Avignon doing a tea gathering, and I was doing tea outside in a courtyard, a square courtyard. When you prepare for a tea gathering, what's the first thing you do? Well, you clean meticulously everything in the place. You remove anything that doesn't need to be there, that won't go into producing a beautiful ambience. And you purify the air so that the ambience that emerges is something that relates to that crisp, cutting mind that emerges after you drink the tea. And other people practicing the same weekend were Gongfu practitioners. And to light the charcoal for our respective tea gatherings, I invited the other people that were practicing that weekend to start their fire out in my hearth, because I was having a hanging kettle and there was a fire pit there in which they would be able to conveniently light their charcoal to use in their tea gatherings that were taking place indoors. But then I experienced things like the preparation of their charcoal and wood that they were using in the fire. They were doing sort of a little bit away from the hearth on steps and sort of towards the wall and that, but still leaving like all this litter from their wood and charcoal just on the ground, as if this part did not matter in the context of the tea gathering that I was composing. And these sorts of things are quite shocking for a chanoyu person. Like, everything in this space is important in terms of the overall aesthetic that I'm creating. So don't come and bloody dirty this space. This is a disconnect, I think, that I see over and over again between Gongfucha and chanoyu. From a chanoyu person's eyes participating in a Gongfucha tea gathering, for us, like, everything in that room there at that time is important. And so having some nice teaware in which to brew the tea and serve people some beautiful cups is fantastic. But what are you doing with that plastic bottle sitting down there by your side to refill your teapot with these bloody disgusting labels on and plastic and all that sort of crap? Like, put it in a beautiful ceramic jar and use a hishaku dipper to scoop and ladle it into your kettle. Like, it's not that much of a stretch, surely. Like, you can see, I'm not trying to be scathing or criticising here, I'm just trying to give you an idea about how the mind of a chanoyu person works in a Gongfucha tea gathering. So pay attention to the details. These are the things that we regard as very important to the overall aesthetic. So there's a difference in emphasis here that's very important in consideration towards bridging the gap between our different practices. And on top of contributing to the overall ambience, each utensil or each piece that's in the room is an opportunity to weave another piece of art with its own history and theme and ideas into the theme that you're trying to evoke and the reason behind why you're all gathering there for that particular occasion. So if I use the tea gatherings that I conducted the other weekend in Avignon as an example, the theme for some of those tea gatherings was the origin of Japanese tea. And I drew a line in the sand of 1191 when Eisai brought the practice of drinking tea in Zen monasteries back to Japan, and started from there. So I would say that the legacy or the heritage of Japanese tea is chanoyu itself, how it's practiced today and continued in the tea schools. The future is another thing that I'll talk about another time, but the origin is in the Yotsugashira chanoyu, or Eisai's practice of Zen monastic tea, and the tocha, the tea battles, before they both merged and became chanoyu. So to evoke these, I use, for example, a meditation bell for the kensui to evoke the sense of Zen temple life. And when a tea ritual starts, it would have been started with the sound of a bell. And so I did that as at the start of the tea preparation ceremony, rang the bell as if we're practicing Yotsugashira that Eisai brought back to Japan. And the chasen in Eisai's monastic tea were placed on the spout of a kettle and brought into the room. And the tea was prepared with tenmoku tea bowls on a stand. So I put the chasen not in its usual position, but on the hook of the chain suspended from the tripod to evoke that sense of the Yotsugashira practice that you can still see in temples like Kenninji, of the chasen sitting on a spout or a hook or something, sticking up in the air and becoming quite central, an aesthetic feature in the overall composition of the ritual. And also using the tenmoku tea bowl for that reason. And then for torture, we don't know exactly how it was practiced. I guess there was many variations. It still is maintained in tea schools today. For example, Omotesenke has a version of chakabuki, which is similar to the torture practice of tasting various types of tea and guessing their origin. But I used kodo, or incense practice, which retains that guesswork of trying to guess the individual fragrances that are offered in a series of different fragrances presented in one sitting to try and identify which ones were what. And that was the torture element. So as I used kodo, or the incense ceremony, or Japanese incense practice, as a reference point to recreate torture, the shelf that I used was a Genji Dana. So Genji Monogatari is a very famous literature work in Japan, the tale of Genji. And in incense practice, it is very important because there's this type of incense practice called Genjiko. You see these lovely insignias that have been developed to signify the 48 different chapters of the tale of Genji. And so my choice of that shelf on which to place my utensils, the Genji Dana, was related to the practice of incense, with Genjiko being something that's quite central to the practice of Japanese incense. And then on top of the shelf, the tana, I had a satsubako. So the satsubako is a piece of equipment that we still use today in the Japanese tea ceremony, chanoyu, in which we house different types of tea that we prepare in the one sitting. So it's basically the only form of tea ceremony that still exists in chanoyu practice where we prepare multiple types of tea in the one sitting. So that was a way to bring the torture element together with today's chanoyu practice. So you can see there's a decision behind each piece that we choose to employ in a chanoyu gathering. And one idea I just had is relating to the details and the composition of a chanoyu gathering, is it kind of relates to a difference in emphasis on aesthetic experience that you can see in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and John Dewey. So Kant said that a pure aesthetic judgment was disinterested. It's a disinterested experience. So we come before a work of art and we experience it without any of our personal desires, beliefs, or specific interests or ulterior motives. We just come before the work of art or the aesthetic object and are completely unattached to our history and are open to experience the resonant beauty of whatever it is that we are experiencing. So for Kant, true aesthetic judgments are characterized by this disinterested aspect, and so therefore they take on a kind of universality. So there's a contemplative appreciation of beauty that is more or less universal for all human beings, that transcends desires, etc. And John Dewey, on the other hand, said that art is experience, and you cannot disconnect your own history and immediate experience, what your emotions are and beliefs are. You cannot chuck that away to be totally disinterested before an aesthetic object. Experience is rhythmic. It oscillates with different degrees of desire and emotion and interest and ulterior motives. But in the end, the aesthetic experience is like the pinnacle of think of a mountain range, and you've got different mountains, different peaks of experience, but the aesthetic experience is the highest peak on the mountain range. It's when you experience yourself being transformed with an active involvement with something of beauty. And chanoyu involves both of these aspects, both the Kantian and John Dewey's view on aesthetic experience. So a criticism that Gongfucha practitioners might have for chanoyu is that it has too much of this disinterestedness. So when you're going through a tea garden, you're meant to leave your everyday concerns and desires and personal views and beliefs and preferences and ulterior motives. You're meant to let them dispel and flow out into nature and let nature take care of them, so that you may enter the tea room as a blank slate. So in other words, Kant's disinterested self. And we can have a pure aesthetic experience in the tea room with our true selves as the experiencer. And Gongfucha practitioners would probably think that this kind of deal or this situation is a bit absurd, because I'd say they would be very much in line with John Dewey's view of the world, that after all, everything is different degrees of desire and interest and motive and perspective. And tea is simply a way to really experience this rhythmic sense of human experience, that everything all the time is oscillating between different degrees of emotion and desire and belief and motive. And tea is just a great way to experience all these aspects of our human state in their richness and fullness. And there's perhaps very little of the Kantian aspect of true aesthetic judgments that's at play in a Gongfucha tea gathering. But for chanoyu, there's definitely both aspects. They can be a chanoyu gathering can definitely be interpreted through the Kantian view, but it's not all. There is also John Dewey's view there. And especially with different tea masters like Rikyū and Oribe, they're different styles of tea. They have different emphasis on both those philosophical approaches. So chanoyu is definitely a peak everyday experience, like the pinnacle of the mountain range. But at the same time, it can be interpreted as retaining some of that contemplative, universal appreciation of beauty that's encapsulated in Kant's view of aesthetic experience. So, chanoyu practitioners, when participating in a Gongfucha tea gathering, don't be too concerned about the details as you would in a chanoyu gathering, and focus more on the sensorial experience of what the tea is doing to you. Like what can you feel it doing in your body and the sensations that it produces in different parts of your body, and the flavours and the various tastes that are at play when you're sipping these different infusions of the same tea. and the mouthfeel and the softness and the harshness and how they vary across different infusions and different teas, and the fragrance, and make sure you smell the fragrance that's left resonating on the ceramic after you've emptied your cup of tea between different infusions. Like, how does that fragrance change over time? And these things really get deeply in tune with the sensorial, experiential mode of being there in a Gongfucha tea gathering. And be lenient on the host's choices for different utensils that they may consider to be in the background and not important to the central motive of being there, which is the tea itself. And for Gongfucha practitioners participating in a chanoyu tea gathering, give the chanoyu practitioner some slack about the details of their tea, because it's not necessarily about the single origin and the region and how it's grown and the type of leaves and how they're produced and everything and all those technical details. We've got the formula. You can ask about that magical formula perhaps and talk about that as a segue into unpacking the toriawase, the selection of the art objects that are in play in that tea gathering to evoke the theme of that particular time. No doubt you, the participant, the Gongfucha practitioner that is there for this particular chanoyu, has influenced the host's decision as to what utensils to choose by their knowledge of your personal preferences. The host really cares about how the tea unifies all the art objects for a peak aesthetic experience for that singular moment in time. There you have it. There's some ideas around how we may be better cultural citizens in our respective pursuits of tea. Hopefully that can enrich our experience of Gongfucha and chanoyu tea gatherings and open the door for Gongfucha and chanoyu to integrating further with the contemporary art world and fashion world and self-development worlds. So thanks for your time and attention. If you want some tea, i.e. matcha tea, you can go to my website and get some. I'll leave the link in the description. If you want to get on the mailing list for this podcast so you don't miss when another one comes out, or any other works that I do, you can sign up on my Patreon for free or paid. If you'd like my Pillar Among the Clouds book, you can see that on my website as well. And if you'd like to learn chanoyu, you can also send me a message via my website. Thanks heaps again, and funk Wabi.